I'm Noll with Purdue Extension, and today we're going to talk about knife skills. So, before you even get started using a knife, it's important to talk about what kind of cutting board you're going to use. So, the most common materials for a cutting board will be plastic, glass, or wood. Today I have a couple different plastic varieties. Glass is not good for your knives. It will dull your blade, and we'll talk about knife sharpening later. But so for the best care of your knives, you want to use something like a hard plastic or wood. If you are going to be doing something with raw meat, it's best to use plastic because these can be better washed than wood. Wood will absorb and those are harder to clean. So I've got a couple different kinds of plastic cutting boards in front of me. This hard one will slide around on your countertop. So if you have a cutting board like this, it's best to put a wet paper towel underneath so it won't slide around. This hard plastic cutting board actually comes with these rubber grips, so that's really nice because it slides less. And I'm actually quickly going to, you can just take a paper towel and dampen it, and then if you put that underneath your cutting board, it will slide around a lot less. So it's a lot sturdier of a surface, and that's really important when we're talking about using a knife. And then you may have these flimsier cutting boards. These are really useful for a lot of things, but improving your knife skills, these are not the top choice. So they're flimsy, they can dull your knife, they can slip around really easily, even if you put something like a paper towel underneath. So this becomes a safety issue. So save these for other tasks. So either using wood or these hard plastic ones are a lot more all-purpose. So we've secured our cutting board. Next we're going to talk about the different kinds of knives. So on each knife, this one's a chef's knife, there are different parts of the blade. So there's the spine, there's the tip, there's the sharp edge or the blade, and then there's the handle. Handles come in all different shapes and sizes, but it's important that it's sturdy. So on this particular knife, you can see that there's one piece of metal that runs from the tip all the way to the end of the handle. Sometimes you'll have the bolts on the handle that'll connect the metal part to the actual handle. As long as it's sturdy, that's fine. If it starts to become wobbly, it may be time to either tighten it or look for a new knife. Knives come at all different price points. There's great knives that are really cheap and there's great knives that are really expensive. But the most important part is making sure that it's a knife that you are comfortable with. So this one is about 7 to 9 inches long. They will come longer. I'm not comfortable with a longer blade, so around 7 to 9 inches on a chef's knife is where I'm most comfortable. So this is a chef's knife. This is another example of a chef's knife. It's a little bit smaller of a blade. So that's, if you're more comfortable with the shorter blade, this is a great choice. There are also serrated knives, so you can see by the jagged edge that is what makes it a serrated blade. These are usually a little longer at 10 to 12 inches. We will use this when we cut our pineapple. So these are great for things that have hard rinds on them because you may dull your chef's knife if you try to cut through like a watermelon or a pineapple. I also use these for some harder winter squash varieties. Bread, people will use them on things like tomatoes because that sawing action helps to cut through. And then there's something smaller. I call these paring knives. Some people will call them utility knives. But the blade is much smaller and it's really great for detail work. So if you need to cut something like a core out of a tomato, you can really get in there. Some people are most confident using this as their just complete knife, and that's great. A lot of times people feel like they need a huge knife collection to be a really great chef or home cook, and that's not true. You really only need 3 to 4 knives tops. So we've talked about the different knives. So like I said, these shorter paring knives are really great for detail work. These serrated knives are good for things that have spines or bread or something like actually slicing a tomato. But I'm most comfortable with this chef knife, so that's what I'm going to go ahead and use. Proper holding of a knife. So the safest spot for a knife when you are not using it is down. If you have someone that you're sharing a kitchen with, the best way to pass off a knife is to put it down on the board, step away, and then let someone else come in and pick it up themselves. My hands are kind of wet because I washed our produce, and so this cutting board has some dampness on it. So if I were to just try to pass a knife, it could slip. Whoever I'm passing it to may have wet hands, and they could make it slip. So the safest way to pass a knife is down on a board. That's where your knife should be if you're not actually holding it to cut it. So when you are picking up a knife to go ahead and cut, you want to use your pincher, so your pointer finger and your thumb, and pinch up at the spine between the blade and the handle. And then your remaining fingers, you want to curl around the handle. So if I'm to flip that over, I don't have a death grip on it. I'm not gripping it as tightly as I can, but it is secure in my hand. We encourage people to hold the knife further up as opposed to somewhere back here like this, because you have a lot more control over the blade. So when I'm holding the knife back here like this, it could slip on whatever I'm cutting, and that can become dangerous, especially for my non-cutting hand. So when you hold it up here with the pincher grip and then wrap your fingers around the handle, you have the most control over your knife. And that's really important. You want to control the knife. You don't want the knife to control you. So we're holding the knife. I always think it's best, especially if you are trying to work up towards your knife skills, to practice the motion of cutting without anything on your board. So we always want to make sure that the tip is pointed down. And so some people will not pick up the knife at all. They'll make sure that that tip is always down on the board. Sometimes it's not always practical depending on what you're cutting, but remember that tip should at least be pointing down. So you want to lead with the tip and then follow through with the rest of your knife. Sometimes I think it's best if you want to practice with your hand. Sometimes that can get you the right motion that you're trying to go. It's not necessarily a force down, it's more of a rocking follow through motion. And again, that gives you the most control, where if I were to just press straight down, whatever I'm cutting may have the opportunity to wiggle around my board, and that can become really unsafe for my non-cutting hand. So you want that rocking motion, the tip pointing down. For your non-cutting hand, you want to make a C and then flip it over, and you want to make sure that your elbow is pointing out. So that makes sure that the blade can move against this flat part of your hand. So ideally, your fingertips would be like a C tucked underneath, and your thumb would be behind it. So it kind of maybe looks like a G if you use your imagination. And then ideally, try to show this the best way, the knife blade would be pressed against the knuckles, and then you would use that rocking motion with the tip on the board, your fingertips tucked underneath, and then your flat part of your knuckle would act like a guide for the knife. I will admit I don't have that completely down pat. So if that's the case, the best way to do it is whatever way you feel the most safe. I will say that if you are one that holds something in your hand and tries to cut that way, I would encourage you to transfer that onto a cutting board and start teaching yourself very slowly how to use proper knife technique. But sometimes I can't quite get my fingers to make the proper shape. And so if that's the case, just try your best. Make sure you know where your fingers are. Sort of like playing a sport, you never want to take your eyes off the cutting board. You always want to see what you're doing. You always want to know where your hands are. But ideally, that blade would be able to rock against that flat part of your knuckle. But always make sure your thumb is behind and then your fingertips are tucked underneath. So that's considered the safest way. Okay, so we are going to go ahead and start cutting and slicing some things. So I have a sweet potato, I have some garlic, and then I have a bell pepper, and I'll talk about cutting something unusual like a pineapple. So there are all sorts of fancy knife techniques, but really the main ones that you would use at home would be slicing, chopping, dicing, mincing, and something called chiffonade. So I'm going to walk through a lot of those. What you will see me do first is try to make a flat surface with my knife. So this sweet potato is unusually shaped. It rolls around really easily on my cutting board. So my first goal here is to make it more stable so I can safely cut it. My ultimate goal, and a good reason to practice your knife skills, is that it can make you a better cook, with the fact being that when you can make things an even size, whether that's slicing or dicing or whatever size you're getting it to, they'll cook at a more even rate, which makes you more efficient. So our first goal before we get things to an even size is to make sure that it's safe for us to hold. So I'm gonna move some stuff out of the way here. So I'm holding my knife up here at the top. My fingers are wrapped around the blade. I'm going to make sure that my fingertips are out of the way and my elbow is pointed out. So you might notice it's not a perfect C, but again, I don't quite have that down, so it's whatever works best for you. So my tip is pointing down, and then I follow through. Now I'm gonna make my next cut to get me a sturdy, stable surface area. So this wiggles around a lot less now, and now I can start slicing. So the first one I'm gonna do is slices. And slices come in all different shapes and sizes. But I'll try to actually talk about what I'm doing here. So tip is pointed down. I'm trying to hold my hand safely out behind it. I see where all my fingertips are so I don't lose one. And then I'm trying my best to follow through. A lot of times I see people just pressing down, which is fine, but you kind of saw when I did that, my knife slipped. And so that's why that follow through motion is important. So if you just press straight down, you run that risk of the wobbling. So these are slices. You can slice all sorts of different things. So for example, I'll slice this bell pepper. So same thing, your goal is to get a flat surface. So the knobs on the bottom of this bell pepper make it uneven. So my first goal is to get myself a flat surface. So I take off the bottom, and now it's a lot less wobbly on my board. So then I can start cutting off the cheeks of this bell pepper. And then, so I've got the cheeks, and then I just make those fluid motions to get my slices. So now we've got slices of sweet potato and we've got slices of bell pepper. So slices can come in all sorts of different shapes. When you slice something with a more waxy skin like a bell pepper, it's safest if you have the flesh up. So you can slice it with the flesh down, but sometimes those tougher waxy skins can make your knife slip, where if you have the flesh up, your knife is more likely to grip to make a cleaner, safer cut. Okay, so when we have our slices, we are going to now do dices. So slices are just lines, and then when we actually dice it, we are going to flip them on their side and start cutting in the other direction. So again, trying to keep my fingertips out of the way, following through. My knife tip is down on the board. And so by going the other way, we have these small dices. So where a dice becomes different than a mince is just a much smaller dice. So a lot of times people will mince things by rocking their knife against the board. So if that's what you're trying to do, and this is really great for something like an herb, you keep your hand flat on the tip of the blade, and you want to make sure that your fingertips are absolutely out of the way. So some people will hold their knife like this. I'm always afraid that it could slip, so I always make sure that I am holding my fingertips straight up in the air, so there's less chance of me slipping my hand down the side of the knife underneath my blade, because that does not make for a good dinner experience. So to mince, you take your dice and you just rock it back and forth. And then you start getting smaller pieces, and that's a mince. If you are after strictly minced, it helps, get this little pile out of the way. It helps if you make smaller cuts. So if I were to mince something like this bell pepper, or this is a sweet potato, but I could make my initial cuts a lot smaller and a lot finer. So you can, and a lot of recipes will say like a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch, and that will affect the cooking time of your recipe. But so these are much smaller slices, and I can make them even smaller here. Make sure to keep your fingers out of the way. But so if you look, our slices kept getting smaller and smaller. And a lot of times fancier knife cuts like julienne are just really small, thin slices. So if I were to mince this, I've made the smallest slices possible, and then again, I just flip it and start going the other direction for a mince. Okay, so now we've got our minced sweet potato. So much, much smaller. If we were to do something like a chop, I'm going to switch to garlic. A lot of times people will ask questions or struggle with kind of taking the skin off of garlic. I always wash my garlic, so it kind of just lives out in the open air at the grocery store or wherever you get it. I don't know how many people have touched it before I pick it up and take it home, so I always at least rinse it off. I try not to do that before I actually use it because it will soften the paper that's protecting the garlic and keeping it shelf stable. But usually that makes it a lot easier to go ahead and start taking that skin off. So this papery skin, once it's wet, should come right off. Another trick that I like to do if you have a really stubborn head of garlic, take a clove if you can get it off, or 2 or 3. You lay it flat down on your board. You pick up your knife and you flip it on its side, and then you lay the blade down on top of the garlic and you hit it with the palm of your hand. So sometimes people will use their whole fist. I'm much more into the heel of my hand, but whatever you're most comfortable with. The trick of this though is you want to hit it straight down and pick it straight up. I've only seen it happen once, but someone drug their hand down and kind of went against the blade. So you don't want to do that. You definitely want to make sure you're going straight down, straight up. If you're nervous to try that, you can take another cutting board and sandwich it and press down on the cutting board. Sometimes if you have a big enough bowl, like a stainless steel or a plastic bowl, you can put that down and wiggle it against it as well. But the goal obviously is to not cut yourself. Okay, so when you whack it like that, the skin should peel right off. And so I always take off the root end as well, just because sometimes it's a little tough when you eat it. And then if we are talking about chopping, so a chop is just a more informal dice. So if you have something like a slice or a dice or a mince, usually the uniform slices and then you flip it and you go a slice again. That's what comes up with those uniform pieces. Chops are much more informal. So again, it's really great for something like an herb where there's only so small of a way that you can make a thyme leaf. So I would call that a chop. You're not necessarily coming up with a dice on something like a thyme leaf. And same thing with the garlic. Usually your goal is just to get it really small. And by smashing it, you sort of help flatten it down as well as getting the skin off. So for a chop, it looks a lot more like a mince or a dice, but your pieces are going to be much more irregular. So you see, and especially if I were to take the time to keep going with that, you see that when we did our sweet potato mince, these are all little perfect squares, where the pieces of garlic are much more irregular. So that would be a chop. You can pretty much chop anything. We did some chops on our bell pepper as well. So you're just not going to end up with those perfect pieces. And depending on your recipe, sometimes that works better. Sometimes you need the perfect pieces for proper cooking time, so everything cooks at the same time and will be done at the same time, but that's not always practical. Okay, so those are our different knife cuts for slicing, dicing, mincing, and chopping. What I'm not showing you today is something called a chiffonade. So that's where you just roll it up and you slice. It works really great for greens if you make a lot of greens at your house. You see it a lot with basil, you see it a lot with spinach or kale or collard greens. So you just you stack all your leaves up and then you roll it into a tight cylinder, and then you just make those same slicing motions that we've done before. And that makes it really easy. It makes sure that everything cooks at the same time and has those uniform sizes. Okay, so I'm going to switch cutting boards really quick, and I'm also going to switch knives. So we are going to cut a pineapple. So this is one that I get a question about a lot. You can buy really fancy tools like pineapple cores. I think that takes up a lot of space in the kitchen. I have a really small kitchen, and so I don't necessarily need extra things there that I'm only going to use for one thing. So something like a pineapple slicer, I can only use on a pineapple, and that's a waste of space in my opinion. So I already own knives, so I would rather use a knife. So on this, you can see it's pretty sturdy already. But we're gonna make our first two cuts to make it even sturdier. So for this, I'm gonna use my serrated knife, so that will help get through this tough, spiny skin of the pineapple. So obviously it's hard for me to hold in a C grip on this because it wiggles around. So this is where you want the firmest grip you can get. But I'm still going to hold my knife in a similar way, so I'm pinching up near the blade at the end of the handle with my thumb and my pointer finger, and then wrapping the rest of my fingers around the rest of the handle, and then the tip is still pointed down. I'm still going to try to make fluid motions, but this works best if you use a sawing motion as well. So pressing straight down doesn't always work. Especially on this, you want to make the knife work for you, and that works best when you saw. So we're gonna go ahead and saw off the top, put that to the side, flip it around, I'm gonna saw off the bottom. Okay, so then now I can flip it up and I have a sturdier surface. Bonus points if you can make a straight cut. I'm staring at this and it's definitely sloped down, so it does take some practice. But so it's a sturdier surface than what it was. So now my goal is to go around the pineapple and take off the rest of the spiny skin. With pineapple, obviously some people prefer, I'm taking off a decent amount of the skin here and getting some flesh in there. These spines run pretty deep within the pineapple, and I think the worst thing of eating pineapple is when you get a big spine in your mouth. So especially on things like melon, some people like to shave off just the very edge of it. So if you notice I'm making a little bit of a deeper cut than you would, it's because I don't enjoy eating those spines. Okay, so goes pretty quick, couple of cuts. Pineapples are very slippery, so at this point I think it always is best if you have a paper towel so you can wipe off your hands and the handle of the knife. So you might have to cut or stop a couple of times between cuts, especially with other juicy items, just to make sure that your hand won't be sitting there slipping around on your knife. So at this point, there are a couple different ways that you can go with this. I'm going to put my serrated knife off to the side and switch to my other chef knife. Before I keep going on the pineapple though, I am going to talk about sharpening your knives. So this is a good opportunity to show that. Honing is not the same as sharpening. So some people will have honing blades at home. What that does is it just makes sure that the blade stays straight. So if you don't hone your blade. There's the chance that the blade could start to curve under and it will be dull. So you're not getting as sharp of a cut. So a sharp knife is much safer. It will cut through the food as opposed to wiggling around on the surface of the food, especially when we were talking about something with a waxy skin like a bell pepper or a tomato. You can always tell when your blade is really dull if it doesn't cut through a bell pepper or a tomato. So honing, just make sure that that blade stays straight. You can hone every single time you use your knife or every other time, but sharpening should be done on all your knives at least once a year. If you are a heavy home cook, you probably want to do it more often than that when you start to notice it doesn't cut as cleanly. But sharp knives are safer. Not only will they cut through the food instead of sliding around, but if you were to cut yourself, it would be a clean cut. Where something like a dull blade, if you're using a lot of force, you may not cut through cleanly, so it would be a ragged wound, or you could cause more issues than just a cut because of the force you're having to use to cut down with that dull knife. Usually serrated blades cannot be sharpened. I buy them really cheap. I think they last a long time because I tend to use my chef knives and my paring knife a lot more. But usually if you buy these cheap, you can get really nice ones for $8 or $10. They generally cannot be sharpened, but just make sure when you are disposing of your knife, I try to call a kitchen center or a grocery store and ask if they have any recommendations of what to do with old knives you're getting away. I don't like just throwing them in the trash, so always check where you're placing those old knives. Okay, so around here, there used to be a kitchen store that I would take my kitchen knives to, and they have closed. So I've not found another place to professionally sharpen my knife that's not at the farmer's market. So if you go to the farmer's market, there will be a sharpening service there. But obviously with winter coming up, there's not always a farmer's market. So you can buy sharpening devices for your own home kitchen. I got this one on the internet on clearance. It was about $20. I cook a lot, so I thought that was a really good investment. Some of these can get really expensive, and so that's up for you to decide if you cook enough to justify it or watch for a sale, or some people who are really serious will have 2 sets of knives, just the basic knives I've shown you, and that will get them through the winter until the farmer's market opens back up. So when one set of knives is dull, then you can get out your reserve set of knives, and that can get you through till when the farmer's market opens. So if you do choose to have a sharpening device of your own at home, make sure you read the directions. So this particular one has 2 separate sharpening blades, and it matters which direction you go in first. So this one has a coarse and a fine. You start with the coarse and you run your knife through 4 or 5 times, and then you move to the fine and go through 4 or 5 times. Make sure that you clean your blade between sharpening, so there could be small pieces of metal that come off when you sharpen, and you don't want that in your food or someone to eat that. But when you use a device like this, it's important that you do those full follow-through motions that we talked about earlier. So if you were to get caught halfway through sharpening, you could put a notch in your blade, and then that becomes unsafe because as you're slicing, things can get stuck there, and then if you have to use force, you could hurt yourself. So if you have one of these come in a lot of different shapes and sizes. Just make sure that you follow the directions, especially for your first time. I think that's where the internet's a really great resource, because you can look up videos of someone using that device, and I learn a lot by watching those. Okay, so back to our pineapple. So I switched to a chef knife from our serrated knife. Some people will cut straight down in the middle, so there's this tougher, more fibrous core in the middle of your pineapple. Some people will cut straight down and then slice off triangles of the core. I prefer to work my way around the core in a square. I feel like, especially with something slippery like a pineapple, if I'm making less cuts to get where I need to go, that's safer. But if you are more confident making like an X essentially, and then flipping the pineapple on the side and cutting out the core that way, by all means feel free. But I'm gonna make just a square around this pineapple because ultimately I'm gonna make less cuts that way. So go ahead and take care of that. So you'll notice I'm not making a C with my non-cutting hand, but I know where all my fingers are. I only put my hands down flat on the food when I am sure the knife has passed that moment. Okay, so then you end up with the core that you can just compost, and then you end up with different sizes of the pineapple. So our goal is to make the same size of the pineapple. So for this one, I'm just gonna make slices. So that ends up in about bite-sized pieces. But for more, some of these larger pieces that we've taken off, you might need to make a slice and then turn it and make a dice. So it depends on what size you come out with. But so then that will help us to get, they're not quite uniform, but about bite-sized pieces. The last thing that I want to talk about are storage and washing. So storing your knives, a lot of times if you buy something like a paring knife, this one was about $3 at Payless, and it came with its own storage sheath. So if your knife comes with its own storage container, definitely store your knife there. When I came here with my knives today, I just had them wrapped up in a kitchen towel and tied with a rubber band. Some people have knife blocks, some people have other kinds of cases that they keep their knives in, but the point is you don't just want your knives shuffling around in the drawer. If the metal surface of a knife bumps into another metal surface of a knife, that can dull your blade, which we've already talked about how that's a less safe knife then. And if they're just floating around your kitchen in a drawer, just anyone can reach into that drawer, pull out a knife, or possibly cut themselves on another knife. So using the storage container that comes with your knife, I store mine in paper kitchen towels. If you have a knife block, that's great too. But you just want to make sure that they're not floating around freely in a random drawer because it'll dull them, and that's a safety issue. When you are washing your knives, the best way to wash your knives is with hot soap and water. Putting them in the dishwasher can dull the blade. They can bounce around in the dishwasher. They can fall through the rack on the dishwasher. So if someone reaches in there, they could hurt themselves. And then again, bumping against other things in your silverware or whatever else you have in the dishwasher can dull that blade. So hand washing, hot soapy water, drying immediately helps. Especially if you have a knife where the handle is not connected to the blade, drying it immediately helps to prevent any rust that may occur if you have two separate pieces up here. And if you just leave it out to air dry, someone could walk through your kitchen, bump into it. So immediately washing, drying, putting away is the safest way. I've worked at restaurants where people just throw the knives into the bucket of dishwater. So that's dangerous because someone could reach in there and hurt themselves. So if you are the one using a knife, the safest way is to wash immediately, dry immediately, put away immediately. Don't put them in the dishwasher. Try not to let them air dry, especially if you have a multi-piece knife going on where the blade's not connected to the handle. And then store them in a knife block as well. So that's all I've got today. I appreciate you watching. Thank you.